Thank you so much for being here tonight. Let's pray and then we'll begin. Father, I thank you for every person in this room tonight. Once again, thank you that they are willing to be a part of this study. Lord, we thank you that you love us so deeply and so richly. And you care for us so well that you would provide us with language to express things we often are not even aware we need to express. Lord, as we look at your word together, as we study this together, I pray that you would open our eyes and open our hearts, that you would use this time for your glory and for our good. And we ask this in your Son's name. Amen. Well, welcome back. Thank you so much for being here, especially on Father's Day. I hope that you had time to celebrate and eat some good food and maybe even get a nap or two. Or maybe you watched the Braves pummel the Rockies. That was fun too. Let's dig into week 2. Now remember, last week we began part 1 of what is lament. We were discussing the nature of lament and beginning to ask that question, what is lament? And this week is part 2 of that discussion. We continue looking at the nature of lament and asking, what is lament? But you had some homework, didn't you? Is that a little scary to hear those words after all this time? Had some homework, and don't worry, we're not going to take the homework up. Each week, we're not going to take homework up. The homework is just for you to begin working out what we are discussing each week. It's an opportunity for you to put into practice the principles that we're discussing in our meetings each week. And so I'm curious, you had your portable practice, as we're calling it, and it had our 3 circles on it: orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. And so you basically had two different assignments, but they were related to one another, because the first one had the 3 circles where you were to come up with 3 experiences for you personally of disorientation. And then you were supposed to get the corresponding orientation and reorientations to go with that. And so I'm curious, and again, when we discuss your homework each week, number 1, we won't be taking it up, but number 2, you don't have to share any more than you want to. We're not prying here. And you can speak in generalizations as well if you don't want to share any of the specifics of your activities. But were you able to come up with 3 experiences of disorientation? Did 3 come to mind? Maybe more? Try 8? 8? So if you didn't get a chance to do that leading up to tonight, don't worry, it's okay. But you might want to go back and do that, because over the next, this is week 2. And after tonight, we'll have 6 more meetings. It's okay. Hey, baby. At various times, we're going to ask you to engage with these experiences of disorientation that you thought of, that you came up with. So you'll want to have these examples so that you can participate in future examples and activities, okay? So if you didn't get a chance to do it, don't worry. But you might want to go back and do that so you'll have examples to pull from in future activities. So once you got your experiences, once you filled in these 3 circles at least 3 times, or as Leisha said, 8 times, you then were asking cards questions. And so you began to engage with those experiences that you were reminded of. And so again, I'm not asking you for specifics of your seasons of disorientation, but I want to kind of dialogue for a moment about how you interacted with those. And I'm curious, when you reflected on your experiences of disorientation, how did the resulting reorientation differ from the preceding orientation? Right? So how did where you ended up after this disorientation differ from where you began? And again, you can speak in generalized terms here, but I'm curious, was there any kind of commonality across your disorientations? Could you observe some patterns in the differences? Any observations there? Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to say, one of mine was work career.
Yes.
And then I made a move with my career
Yes.
to Southern California.
Yes.
So my disorientation was, is that right? Yeah, disorientation was making that move
Mm-hmm.
and physically making that move, but emotionally making that move.
Yes. Yeah.
Family, friends, everything I knew here
Yeah.
to no one that I knew there.
Yeah.
And then the reorientation, I found myself patterning my life out there much as I had here,
Oh, interesting.
which was finding a church family,
Yeah.
being involved in Emmaus out there, even my work, getting to know my colleagues, that sort of thing.
That's a really interesting example.
The drive on the I-5 and
A little different than Woodward Avenue, isn't it? So I think everybody could hear, but Alicia was discussing the experience of moving across the country, and the reordering of her life was in a different place, a completely different setting. But she began to kind of put things back in a similar way to the way things were. It wasn't the same, but she found herself kind of finding her way in a similar pattern. That's a really interesting reflection on the nature of this process in general, because you end up in a completely different place, but even as you're putting things back together, you try the best you can to put things where they were. That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. You have a comment over here?
I was just going to say, the reorientation isn't necessarily better than the orientation. Sometimes the orientation is better.
Sometimes.
You're dealing with something bad and disorientation. Did I say that right?
Yes, absolutely.
Reorientation is not always better than orientation.
That's interesting.
Because you might have something bad that happened, but you just have to, you're learning to deal with it during that
Reorientation process.
different, but not necessarily better.
So she's saying that the reorientation in some of her observation was not necessarily better than the orientation. So I'm curious, did anyone else observe this in their own experiences? Especially when it came to death. That's absolutely right.
That's what I was thinking of. I kind of went
Yes.
in a different direction because in the disorientation part of things that's happened in my life, I was always taught to question. And so I sat down and wrote out questions
Sure.
that I wanted God to know.
Yeah.
And didn't, like I was taught to gloss over it.
Yeah.
It's going to be okay. You can go on. But I went in deep with the pain part of it.
Yeah. So George is saying that she was taught in these seasons of disorientation, you don't ask questions. You just move forward. And that is definitely the common teaching, I think especially in the South. Now, I've never lived anywhere but the South, so I can't say for certain. But it seems to me that's a very Southern sentiment and difficulty. And it's not uncommon at all. And so what Georgia was saying is that she all of a sudden put herself back in these situations of and correct me if I'm wrong, but she recalled these seasons of disorientation, and she asked the questions that she was taught not to ask when she was experiencing it. And yeah, and I think that's a beautiful exercise. Yeah, that's really great. Yes, ma'am. Sure. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
that may not be the spot.
Yeah.
And so I've been disability for a very short time, started a new job, but at the time, it was very upsetting.
Yeah, that loss of job is I mean, that's a big change, isn't it? Things definitely aren't where they used to be when that job goes away. I think, so if we circle back for a moment, I do think it's a valid point that sometimes that reorientation isn't better necessarily than the orientation. I think that's an important point to remember because, and Harold alluded to this afterwards last week because he said that a spiral always goes up. But I think that when Golden Gay makes that clarification for Bruggeman, I don't think, and I didn't do a good job of communicating this last week, he's not necessarily saying that you always are going upward, but it's a spiral that moves in both directions, right? Because you could be moving down the spiral. But the point of it is that where you end up coming out of the disorientation is different than where you began. And that's what he's getting at. That sometimes it will be a classic upward spiral where you come out stronger than you were before and things are different. But then other times it will be, especially when the disorientation is oriented. Sorry, that's kind of a confusing way to say it. When the disorientation pertains to someone dying, right? That person is not back. When you emerge from the other side and you are finding yourself in reorientation, you're putting things back together without that person. And so I think that is a great point, and I think that that's an important point for us to keep in mind as we look at lament, because so often in a study like this, the temptation is to treat the topic, the subject matter, as kind of a, quote, silver bullet, a magic get-out-of-jail-free card. And I don't want at any point to convey to you that lament is that. Lament is not some kind of magic formula that helps you deal with all of your sorrows and you just are never sad again. No, you'll see. What were our two questions of cards? It was a question of God's presence and a question of God's love. And so the important thing, lament, when we have experiences of disorientation, we often want answers. And sometimes God gives us those answers. But the guarantee is not answers. The guarantee is that God is going to give us himself and he's going to give us his love. And that's how we come into a place of reorientation. Even if it's different, even if it maybe isn't necessarily better, we come out on the other side understanding that even when the worst happens, even when we find ourselves completely disoriented and cut off from the world as we knew it and understood it, that presence of God in our life and that love of God over us that we question in that moment of disorientation, that's what we emerge from in the system of reorientation. That's what we have to move forward. And we're going to talk about that a little more in depth tonight, but that's a great point, and I appreciate you making that. One other question for you out of the homework. So as you looked at these different seasons of disorientation, I'm curious, did you find them to interact with one another? Were there impacts from one disorientation to the next?
So with that, one of mine was, obviously when I had kidney failure.
Sure.
It was a lot of that questioning thing, but I didn't want to question because I felt like I was doubting God and if he would heal, or if if I questioned him or if I had any concerns that he would not bestow healing upon me.
Yeah.
It's not, I know it's not an if then this, kind of situation. But through that and through the transplant, everything, I was able to look back and when I went through 2020 was a heck of a year for a lot of people. A lot of crap happened. So
Yeah.
when I went through some of those really hard things, I allowed myself, or I felt like I was allowed to ask those questions and to sit in my anger and to sit in my frustration a lot more readily. And
Yeah.
not question my faith or whether God was actually going to pull through if I was mad at him.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is a great point that when you experience disorientation, you're better prepared for it the next time it comes around, right? So the things you weren't willing to ask with the kidney failure, you hit 2020 where you had COVID, of course, like everybody else, but you lost your job in 2020, you lost your dad in 2020, and you were better prepared to do. You were more ready to talk with God honestly in that moment because you had endured previously. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I felt like I had more trust in him because I had become reoriented.
Yes.
I was able to look back and say, okay, I did ask some hard questions. I did question and kind of challenge God.
Yeah.
I was able to look back and say, and I felt more confident in my faith in him. I felt more rooted that if I ask these questions, it's not going to set the toss aside like.
Yes. So not only had were you better prepared to question, but you had experienced that presence and that steadfast love endure. So you had greater faith as a result of the disorientation. So when you get to the next disorientation, you're better prepared for it. When I was a student minister, I had a kid who had really weird eating habits. Like, I know everybody's encountered picky eaters, but this guy was to the extreme, to the point that he didn't even want to go with us because he thought, I just won't have anything to eat. And so every time we would get ready to go somewhere, he would be very anxious about it. And finally, about the third or fourth outing, trip, whatever, I just finally looked at him and I said, buddy, have I ever let you go hungry before? And he said, no. And he just trusted me from that point. And on a much grander scale, that's what Leah's saying, is that, in the moment of disorientation, we're often concerned and we rightfully are asking questions of God, and we're asking him to intervene, we're asking him to change things. But the more he does it, the more we trust him to do it again. And so in that way, the disorientation prepares us for the next one. Absolutely. Any other? Somebody over here was starting one.
Kind of similar to Leah, but I've been lamenting, and you and I had this conversation when you did your first one. I've lamented for a long time.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's because of my household. My daddy was very open about a lot of things.
Yeah.
And saying it's okay. And after his death, I lamented a lot, even as a teenager.
Yeah.
But I found that from that point and the other things that I've gone through that I listed, and of course most recently all the things that we've been through with Mike, that it lamenting not only helps you see where he takes you, even if you're disoriented or not as oriented as you wanted to be when you started, your relationship with him is so much stronger.
Yeah.
Each time,
Yeah.
that it's easier to lament to him because you know he's carried you
Yes.
again.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I thought about, Mike, before we took your first session, lament to him and his faith. You've never heard of it.
Yeah. And that's not uncommon. I mean, it's just, and even if you've heard of lament, it's not something we really typically engage with. It's not, if you go turn on, and this, please don't take this as a critique of Christian radio. I don't mean it that way. But if you turn on any Christian radio station in the country, they're going to describe themselves in some variety of positive and uplifting. And that's the target. That's their selling point. Listen to us, we're positive and uplifting. They mean we're not going to talk bad about people, we're not going to curse, and you're going to feel good. And that's kind of what we think our prayer life ought to be, because we're taught that. And in fairness to the Christian radio stations, they're not telling you this is what faith looks like. They're just telling you this is what our music that we're playing is going to look like. But we unwittingly begin to adopt that as kind of our posture of faith. And so I think that's absolutely right on. And I think that what we're dancing around here is the fact that these seasons of disorientation, and we're going to talk about this tonight now, become formative. They change us. And so the details of the circumstances may not have a lot of overlap, but the way that it impacts us and the way that it impacts our faith are absolutely intermingled, inseparable even. So if you didn't get a chance to think of your seasons of disorientation, again, no worries. I'm not going to take up your homework every week, but you're going to want that ammunition. You're going to want those seasons to reflect on as we gather together for the next tonight plus 6 more weeks. So go back with me for a moment. And last week, remember, we talked about the seasons and the way that they change. And we kind of alluded to this last week, but when the seasons come, tell me, what are some ways that you can identify the seasons are changing? What are some exterior environmental factors that you look and you go, oh, okay, we're heading into a new season? Temperature change? Leaves, flowers blooming? Yes, it's not a trick question. We talked about it a little bit last week. You just begin to see these signs everywhere. Birds chirping, first snow. The first morning you walk outside and don't immediately start sweating, you think, oh, this is different. And then a couple of days later, it's back to the sweating. But let me ask you this. If you walk outside and you think, okay, winter's coming, you begin taking steps to counter the cold, right? You don't just think to yourself, I don't want to be cold anymore. But you take action. What are some things you do? Let's just go from fall to winter. As the temperatures drop, what are some things that you might do to counteract those lower temperatures? What was that? Cover your outside faucets. Clean out your chimney to get ready for a fire. Yes. What? Wear a coat. Absolutely. Pick up some what? Ice melt. Yes. Yeah. Keep you from falling down, right? Not around here, but some places you're going to put chains on the tires. Check your heating system. Yes. What do you do? Let's flip that now. What do you do going into the oppressive heat of summer? What are some things you do to counteract that environmental change? Get out the shorts. Yeah. Turn on that AC. Service the AC, definitely. Does your diet change in the summer? Popsicles, ice cream, get the watermelon. Yes, salads. You're not eating a lot of heavy soups, are you? We were just talking about that earlier too, weren't we? That's not typical, right? And I love coffee and I drink it year round, but the hot coffee in the middle of the day, maybe not as much, You maybe want a frozen Coke instead. Or maybe that's just me, I don't know. But my point is, and I said this, is that when you identify those seasons changing, you don't just say, I don't want to be cold, or I don't want to be hot, but there are actionable steps that you take, things that you do to be prepared for those changing seasons. And tonight, our discussion is going to be oriented around this idea. See, just as we have certain practices to help mitigate the effects of the seasons, biblical lament gives us specific practices that serve us well in seasons of disorientation. When we look around us and we say, hey, I'm moving out of everything that I've known, I'm going into the unknown, and I don't know what to do. Lament gives us things to hold on to, things to do to help us in those times. Now, just as putting a coat on doesn't make winter go away, the act of lament doesn't make the disorientation go away. That's not what I'm saying. But it's what we are able to do as we endure those times, as we walk through those seasons before the next one comes along. And so tonight, everybody got a handout. Everybody's got a handout with five blanks and then 2 below. So 7, okay. So last week, I didn't change, I'm sorry. I asked a question without putting it on the screen. That's a penalty, 15 yards. I want to introduce, last week we met Walter Brueggemann. Let's go back a little further than Walter Brueggemann to a German man named Klaus Westermann. Now, without chasing too much of a wild hare here, the way that we engage the Psalms now can largely be traced back to a scholar named Hermann Gunkel. Okay, and he was the one who advocated organizing the Psalms into genres, kind of like when you used to go into a record store, you'd have everything organized by genre. He did the same thing with the Psalms, and that didn't change the Psalms. Okay, he didn't alter anything, but the way that it made it easier for us to understand it. Just like when you go to buy a CD, you knew where to look. Well, shortly after Gunkel, there was a man named Klaus Westermann, and he kind of stood on those shoulders and began dealing with the implications of those genres. And one of those genres, of course, was lament. And Westerman's impact has impacted deeply the study of the Psalms in general, but particularly the way that we engage with lament. I found this very interesting, and I hope you will as well. Westerman was, as you might suspect from his name, German, and lived through World War II. And coming out of World War II, he wrote a great book called Praise and Lament in the Psalms. It's kind of two books, really, a praise book and a lament book. And in the introduction, he says, he's writing this in the immediate aftermath of World War II in Germany. Talk about a season of disorientation. That's a big one. And he says, all we have in our worship services are laments. We need to recover praise. Isn't that interesting? They had nothing but lament, and they wanted to recover praise. So he writes, kind of from the opposite perspective we're in now. Now we're talking about everything being positive and uplifting, and we need to recover the laments. And I thought that was very interesting. And I don't think unrelated, because all of a sudden there was the emphasis placed on we've got to praise, and it becomes intoxicating. It becomes all-encompassing. And now we find ourselves, as we often do, we've swung too far in the other direction, and we've got to find our way back to the middle. So Westerman, one of the ways he impacted the study of lament is that he identifies 5 elements that are common for laments. Now, before we get into these 5 elements, I want you to hear me clearly. This is not a rigid system. This is not like your anatomy class where if something's missing, something's wrong. No, this is all 5 of these don't appear in every psalm of lament. So it's not a situation where, if you identify 4 of the 5, well, it's not a lament because we're missing that 5th one. No, that's not the way it works. It's not rigid. They're not all present in every one. They don't always occur in order. It's not a chronological expression. And even more so, they're seldom ever linear. And what I mean by that is it's not a straight line you can go through, a process where you're like, okay, I've done step 1, I've done step 2, next is step 3. No, you might read a Psalm of David and he goes 1, 2, 4, 1, 3, 1, 5, 4, 5. I just made that up. That wasn't patterned off of a specific psalm. But my point is that they're not always linear. You're not going to go in order with these. Okay? So as we talk about these, we like things to be orderly. We like things to follow the pattern that we know. And so I'm offering you this. Westerman, I guess, really is offering us this. But he's not doing so and saying you can count on this every time. He's saying these are the 5 elements that are most common in the expression of lament in the Psalms. Does that make sense for everybody? Everybody, you're not going to hold me to 5 every time, right? Okay. All right, well then let's get into this. Let's look at the 5 most common elements of biblical lament. First is the address. And you see already, underscoring the non-rigid format, is I've got a parenthetical out to the side. So the address, often with an introductory petition. Here's what you need to know about the address. And under your blanks, I left you room to take notes if you so choose about the description of each of these elements. When we come to the address, it's an indication of who the psalmist is directing his prayer towards. Who the psalmist is directing his prayer towards. It's not unlike on a Sunday, when the disciples asked Jesus, teach us to pray, he said, our Father in heaven. That's the address of the Lord's Prayer. Or maybe in the way that we might write a letter, and at the top you're going to say, dear, and then the person you're writing the letter to. But often with this address, the psalmist will immediately offer an introductory petition. It's not going to be the most elaborate petition of the lament, but it's going to establish a need right off the bat. Address the Lord, express the need. And that's not every time, again, because remember, we're not dealing in a rigid system here. But you can count on some indication of who this lament is directed towards. And very often, alongside of that, you're immediately going to get an initial request, an initial thing that the psalmist needs from the person he's addressing it to, which is God. Now, that petition is going to be very brief. It's not going to offer a lot of context or detail. It's going to be like, Lord, help me. Lord, help me could mean, that could be applicable to any number of situations. But it's a petition nonetheless. Does that make sense? So we first see in the Psalms of Lament, we see this address often accompanied with an introductory petition. But then we move next, appropriately enough, into lamentation. And I say next. When I say next here, I'm just saying this is the next one we're going to talk about because it's not always in order chronologically. But in the lamentation, the psalmist is voicing his plight to God. And to be quite honest, if your children or grandchildren came to you and said these kinds of things that we find in the Psalms, you would probably accuse them of whining. The psalmists, as they express these lamentations, come very close to what a southerner would call whining. See, they don't pull any punches. They are outlining in great detail the depth of their suffering when they come to the section of lamentation. It's important to note that these detailed descriptions, though, are detailed, but they remain general enough that they can be easily voiced by others. And see, this is a very important pattern, not only in the Psalms of Lament, but in the Psalms in general. The Psalms are born from specific, tangible circumstances. They're written by real people. Remember last week we talked about that description, that they're the language of grocery lists, that everyday language out of everyday life. But they're expressed in such a way that we can put them on, try them on as our own. It's a wonderful, it's a blessing feature, it's a grace that the Psalms are written in such a way that even though they are for a specific circumstance, they are broad enough that they can be used by us. We can come to a Psalm of David, a lament or a praise or any other expression, and we may not even know what David was writing out of. Often we don't. But we come to it and we think, Lord, that's exactly how I feel. Or maybe that's exactly how I want to feel. Lord, help me to grow into this. And so in that way, the Psalms are extremely valuable to us in the life of faith. And particularly as we come to lament, because the psalmist, in the section of lamentation, he is going to pull no punches. And I'm saying he because that's the penmanship of the Psalms, okay? So please don't be offended. I'm not excluding females from expressing lament, okay? They're a gift to God's people in general, regardless whether male or female. But the Psalms are written by men, or so they're attributed. And so when I say he, that's the reason there. Coming out of the Southern Baptist Convention last week, I just felt like I needed to clear the air a little bit there. But though they are specific, though he pulls no punches, though he does not sugarcoat anything, it's still accessible language somehow. And if you've ever attempted to write creatively, if you've tried to write a song or a story, you want it to be identifiable, and you recognize just how difficult that is for you to write from your personal experience and it still be something that other people value and cherish. But we find that in the Psalms, and we find that in the expression of lamentation in these Psalms of lament. So, first element we see is the address, often accompanied by an introductory petition. Next, we see the expression of lamentation. Third, we will see a turning to God. And this parenthetical is maybe a different way to state that, a confession of trust. Now, we have to acknowledge here that the very fact that we are addressing God with our lament makes that trust implicit. The very fact that you're voicing this prayer to God implies that you are trusting in Him. But the psalmist does not just leave it to be implicit, he makes it explicit, because he will specifically say, I'm trusting in you. Maybe even those very words, Lord, I'm trusting in you. The circumstances may seem to warrant distrust, But instead, the psalmist expresses that even though things seem to be spinning out of control, his trust is still in the Lord. So we see an address, we see a lamentation, and we see a turning to God, also known as a confession of trust. Any questions so far as we near a little over halfway point in our 5 elements? Okay, let's move on to number 4, petition. Petition. Now we've had an introductory petition, but now we have a proper petition, a thorough petition. Because the psalmist trusts in the Lord, he asks God to intervene in his suffering. This is once again specific to the psalmist's circumstances, but remains useful for others' situation, including our own. And these petitions are often expressed along the lines of the 2 questions that we talked about last week, proposed by Michael Card. The psalmist may ask God, please restore your presence to me. Or the psalmist may ask God, please get back to acting like you said you would. Resume acting according to your steadfast love. But often the petition may be, Lord, vanquish my enemies. Do away with my foes. Maybe even in language we're uncomfortable with when we're told to love one another. But there is a petition, a request of God. I would dare say a demand of God. We want to polish our prayers, as we've alluded to, as we've discussed our past examples of disorientation, but there's no polish in these petitions. Demands are made. There's weeping and gnashing of teeth. There's rage even. But the petition is still made to God. All right? And then our final element of lament is the vow of praise. Many lament. In fact, I think it's safe to say all but one lament in the Psalms include this upward glimmer of hope. There was a song playing earlier that is on the playlist I've got for this. It's a Need to Breathe song, and it says, here in this wasteland where I'm living, there's a crack in the door filled with light, and it's all that I need to get by. And I think of that line often when I'm thinking about this vow of praise. It's that little glimmer of hope. And this vow of praise, we can take it 2 ways, and it's expressed in 2 ways. One, it can be regarded as an expression of the depth of the psalmist's trust in God. So what I mean is the psalmist is making this vow saying, Lord, I know you're going to intervene, and I promise that I'm going to praise you when you do. Does that make sense? Like, I know you're going to come through, and when you do, I promise that I'm going to praise. But there's a second way that we can regard this vow. And sometimes it's expressed in both of these ways. It can be both and. It's not necessarily an either or. But the second way, the vow of praise is issued as an enticement for God to intervene. God, if you will save me, then I will praise you. Your kids do this, right? Mom, Dad, if you'll do this, then I'll go clean my room. If you'll grant me this request, I will never throw my dirty clothes on the floor again. Do you ever hear those kinds of things? And see, sometimes we see that expression from the psalmist. It doesn't have to be either or, it can be both. It can be confidence in God and also, hey, it's a little bit of enticement, a little bit of greasing the wheels of God's intervention. But that vow is issued nonetheless. Vow of praise. So as we look at these 5 elements, though, the great thing about biblical scholarship is that it tends to build. You tend to stack up, to stand on the shoulders of giants, as Dr. Timothy George puts it. And Walter Brueggemann, that we met last week, not in person, he wasn't here, I'm sorry. I was a poor substitute. But Brueggemann looks at Westerman's 5 elements, and he kind of subdivides them for us. And this subdivision, I think, is valuable for us to help to see the general trajectory of lament. Because the first 4 elements can be organized as plea, P-L-E-A, or protest. This is the expression of almost the biggest point of disorientation, so to speak. The first 4 elements. Think about these: the address, the lamentation, the turning to God, the petition, they are all what we might consider negative language. Does that make sense? That a lot of times those four expressions in these Psalms of Lament are the things that are going to make us squirm, because we've been taught that these are not appropriate expressions in the life of faith. But our second subdivision, we move from protest to praise. That final one, and it's in the word, right? Vow of praise, we're going to praise. And that gives us kind of the general direction that lament is traveling in. Because even though we may get out of the disorientation into a reorientation that is not better necessarily than the original orientation, we get to a place where our trust in God is deeper. And the more we trust Him, the more we praise Him. So we have this motion in lament from protest to praise, from plea to praise. The spiral may not always be going up, but the experience of God's presence and His love are always what we find coming out of that disorientation. It doesn't mean we never get back into disorientation where we think it's not there again, but it means that we're consistently exposed to that. So, to summarize, we've got 5, I'm going to put them up here, 5 elements of lament. 1, the address with an introductory petition. 2, lamentation. Yes, 2, that's right, yes. 3, a turning to God, also known as a confession of trust. 4, petition. And 5, vow of praise. But remember, with that, we've got 2 subdivisions. Protest, the first 4, to praise. You might, and to put it this way, like the first 4 are in yellow, the protest is in yellow, the praise is in blue. He heard me say 2, and he's like, I know that one, 2. But you see, the yellow is our protest phase, our protest subdivision, and the blue there, the vow of praise, is our praise subdivision, so to speak. So does anybody have any questions about this kind of skeleton, so to speak, of lament? Last week we were looking at lament from 30,000 feet, and now we're zeroing in and we're looking under the hood and we're seeing what is there, what's making it go. And I think that you'll find as we engage with the Psalms of Lament that these 5 elements are consistently what are making that go, what are making us move from protest to praise. So, anybody have any questions about these 5 elements?
I was interested when you said, would you call it nice?
Yes.
I'll do this and I'll do that. I've always been real afraid
Sure.
to say that because I'm thinking, okay, what if he does it? And then what if I don't follow through with what I said?
Yes.
So I'm always,
Yeah.
I've always said, well, I'm afraid to say it.
Yeah, I don't think that's unique at all. I think we're taught, don't make deals with God. Don't do that. And I think that, to speak out of both sides of my mouth, I think that's true, but I also think it's okay for us to make these deals, And I think that as we encounter Psalms of Lament, because we're going to encounter at least one Psalm of Lament every week of this, you're going to see, though, it is consistent. This, God, if you will do this, I will praise you. And we can take it both ways, but it's certainly expressed both ways. You can't come to the Psalms and think, oh, it's always, that vow of praise is always issued from a place of confidence. No, often it is evident. No, the psalmist is deal-making here. Think about Moses. You often hear when Moses was on Sinai and the Israelites began to worship the golden calf, God says, Moses, get ready. I'm killing them all and I'm starting over with you. You remember this? And what does Moses say? He says, Lord, no. And he makes a deal with God, doesn't he? He says, God, think about it. You rescued us from Egypt. If you just kill us now, everybody is going to say that God couldn't save them. He brought him out there to kill him. He is offering enticement. It's almost reverse psychology. If your child was speaking to you this way, you'd think, come on now, I see right through that. And certainly God saw right through it. But God relented. Did he wipe out Israel right there? No, there was a plague, and they had to melt the calf down, and they had to expel it, after they drank the water. Moses threw the ashes into the water. They all had to drink it and expel it. So there were consequences. But Moses offers that enticement, that reason for God to spare the people. And we see that attitude. It's not unique to Moses in that situation. We see it in the Psalms, but we also see it in the narrative of Scripture. And so I think that this is one of the many ways that lament directs us to reckon with the ways that we misunderstand our relationship to God. It's not that our God is a deal maker, but it's that our God has brought us into his covenant in such a way that we are free to say these things. We are free to make these expressions. And because we can offer the vow of praise from confidence, that makes it even more suitable for us to offer these enticements. And I'm not up here saying that it's easy to think, I'm going to make a deal with God. Even, it's always going to be uncomfortable on some level to do so. But the undeniable record of God's word tells us that this is the way that God's people have interacted with him. All the way back. All the way back to Moses. All the way back even to Abram, which is where we can trace our beginnings as the people of God, where that covenant begins. Abram would strike deals with God. He would even take matters into his own hands, famously and disastrously. But it is an uncomfortable encounter when we come to it in God's word. But it's a needed corrective for us to understand the way that we come to God in these seasons of disorientation. So I agree with you. It's weird. To put it mildly, to put it kind of politely, it's weird when we come to this language in the Psalms. But it's not like it's just in one or two of the Psalms. It's across the Psalms of lament, from Psalm 1 to Psalm 150. When you encounter one, more often than not, you're going to get these vows of praise that are either or, both and, an expression of confidence, but also an attempt at enticing God to act. I don't want to, we're going to talk at length about Jesus' example in lamenting, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. And I also don't want to stand up here and say too much, but think about the Garden of Gethsemane. Even in that moment, the Lord Jesus is making these petitions. Lord, if there's a way, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but yours be done. On some level, that's kind of a deal-making conversation with God. It's not a true enticement like we've just seen here or like we'll see in the Psalms, but it's from that posture of, Lord, I'm asking you to do this. And on some level, every petition is an enticement, is it not? Lord, you got to spare me so that I can live on. You got to do this for me. So this is one of those things in lament that we've got to put on and kind of grow into. Like when one of these boys maybe will put my shoes on. It doesn't fit yet, but one day it will. And I think that when we get to the vow of praise and that idea of enticing God, I think that's one of those things that we have to grow into, because we can do it now, we can replicate that language, but we may do it in such a way that's self-centered rather than God-centered. Does that make sense? Because Jesus comes to it and he says, not your will, but mine be done. And we can often come to it and just say, Lord, I want my way. Do this and I'll do whatever you want me to do.
Do you ever think God thinks that's humorous in a way?
Oh, I'm sure.
Our kids do it to us. We
Sure.
still love them just like we always did, and almost laugh at them.
Yeah.
Inside, you're laughing at some of the deals they want to make.
I think that's a great point, but I think our passage, we read from Luke 12 this morning to start our service. It was the stuff of memory verses, wasn't it? Talking about the flowers of the field and the birds of the air, and God caring for us even more than them. And I think that often that God laughs at us when we do this, because he thinks, you really think you have to talk me into loving you? You really think that you have to talk me into looking out for you and doing what is best for you? And so I do think that surely there may be occasions, but there may also be occasions when the Lord says, how long do I have to put up with this? Like Jesus would say, how long do I have to bear with you? Any other questions about our 5 elements or our kind of 2 subdivisions there? You're ready to tackle these 5 elements, aren't you? I can see it in your eyes. So here's what I want to do tonight. Everything we're doing in this 8-week study is not meant to be philosophical or theoretical. We want this to be tangible. We want to be able to put this into action. And so tonight, I want to put this into action using Psalm 13. Now, Psalm 13 is kind of a... Pam, would you mind passing these out? Psalm 13 is short. It's 6 verses. 6 verses, but it is as clean an example of a psalm of lament as you will find in the Psalms. 6 verses, but we get all 5 elements very clearly demonstrated. So what I want you to do, you're all in tables, which our tables really worked out well for dividing into groups. I want you as a table, you're going to get this Psalm 13 journaling sheet and get that pen moving on it, and we want to identify, I'll put the 5 elements back up here so you can see them. We want to identify all 5 of these elements in Psalm 13. We want to see where we can find them. Okay? So we'll give you a few minutes to talk through them, to read through the psalm. Why don't you all as a table read through it all the way one time and then start identifying our 5 elements. And here's that song, Wasteland, coming up right away. I didn't do that on purpose.
I'm the first one in line to die when the cavalry comes.
All right. So let's talk about Psalm 13. Could you find all 5 elements? Do you see them all? All right. Tell me, where do you see the address? Right off the bat, how long, O Lord? How long, O Lord? The address in this one comes right away. How long, O Lord? So good. What about the lamentation? Where are you seeing that? Are you seeing the lamentation? 2. Rest of verse 1 and then through the end of verse 2. Absolutely. The psalmist says, how long, O Lord? And then, like I told you, we'd kind of, some teenager tells you this, you're like, quit being melodramatic, right? The psalmist says, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Did you say it's like whining? It is. It is. But it's true. I mean, he's expressing this from the depths. And if you think of your experience of disorientation, these are things that you might, these may well be questions you were asking God, although you were probably asking more specific questions when you engaged in that way. But this is how we often feel in these moments of disorientation. And I think that our quickness to accuse people of whining contributes to our discomfort with expressing lament. We don't want to be known as a whiner. So good. So we've seen the address. We've seen the lament. Tell me, do you see a turning to God / confession of trust? Do you see this expressed anywhere? 3 and 4, interesting. Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest my enemies say, I have prevailed over him. Lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken. You think that's petition? I would agree that 3 and 4 are petition.
Timmy, is there a little bit of deal making maybe there? Like, lest I sleep
Yep.
in death, like basically, you don't want me to die, God. You don't want people to gloat over me. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, there's absolutely some enticement there. There is. Deal making is taking place. He's like, I'm going to die if you don't do this. Light up my eyes. That's a phrase we wouldn't use, but he's saying, keep these eyes open, keep me living, keep the light of life in those eyes. And then he says, yes, lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken. Anytime you see that language, lest my foes rejoice because I'm shaken, or don't let my enemies triumph over me, Psalm 51, who was talking about Psalm 51 with me earlier? You, yeah. So Psalm 51, that David writes after his experience with Bathsheba, he says, don't let my enemies triumph over me. He says that right there. That expression always is, you see those hints of deal making, right? God, don't let my enemies triumph. What he's saying is, God, make sure you're showing that you're the the biggest God on the block. Yeah, this is great because what we're seeing is that the line of demarcation is not always obvious, and there is always overlap as well. So we've seen the turning to God, but I'm curious. I mean, we've seen in the petition in verses 3 and 4, but have we got a good, firm expression of turning to God, a confession of trust here? Verse 5. Yes, he says the word trust, doesn't he? But I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. So we see both. Now, I think that, so when I first asked for turning to God, you guys mentioned verses 3 and 4. And I think that's an important thing for us to realize, that when we make a petition, the fact that we're making the petition to God is on some level an expression of trust, isn't it? So there is some overlap there. And once again, we see that these are not rigid divisions within the Psalms. But, you know, when we look at them, when we look at 3 and 4 and 5, we can see, well, 3 or 4 really are more of a petition because he's making his specific request here. But 5, he's expressing that trust specifically. He's confessing that trust. And to our aid, he even just uses the word trusted right there for us to see it. And we appreciate that very much, David. That was very kind of you. So we've seen 4 of the 5. What about our vow of praise? Do you see that? Verse 6. And you can even see it in the second half of verse 5, can't you? My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. So he's expressing that confident. And he says, I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. So in this particular psalm, our vow of praise leans more toward the confident expression, doesn't it? Now we see enticements, as Tim has pointed out to us. But when we see this vow of praise, it's more of from a place of confidence. The Lord, my heart shall rejoice. I will sing because he has dealt bountifully with me. Yeah, he's trusting God. Yeah. And so when we're expressing that vow of praise from a place of confidence, it absolutely is an expression of trust. Do you see that trajectory from protest to praise in this psalm? Is that present? Can we follow that line? And you're going to find that even in that regard, these psalms are not always linear. We may be, we want to think protest to praise is always going to be a straight line, a good rise over run graph if you're a mathematics student. Were you a math teacher? You are currently a math teacher, yeah. So rise, you want that. We love that. Many of us, myself included, math just really doesn't make sense once we get off that linear scale, doesn't it? But we're going to find that the general trajectory is going to be from protest to praise, but it is not always a nice, clean line. We may be going from protest to praise, and then we remember, oh, wait. We don't like what's going on here. So we're going back down into the depths. We're expressing more lament. You're going to find that as we encounter different psalms, this one is brief. It's pretty concise, and we see even in it the 5 elements expressed. And because it's so brief, there's not time for a lot of this, a lot of ups and downs. So we get that general trajectory as a straight line in this psalm in a lot of ways. But as we encounter longer and more complex psalms, you're going to find that the psalmist is going to start, and he's upset, he's angry, but he all of a sudden will find praise, but then he'll think, no, I'm not ready to say that yet. And he'll go back down, and he'll start fussing again. So nothing about this, very little about this is going to be linear, you're going to find. But if we look, just as you may look at the stock market, you may look and see this week was terrible for whatever it is I own. But you can go and look at the year to date, and it's going to be red or green, right? It's going to be red if that trajectory is downward. It's going to be green if that trajectory is upward. But though the beginning and the end may be an upward growth, there may be all kinds of peaks and valleys along the way. And that's going to be the nature of dealing with lament, and quite frankly, the nature of living in faith. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I could see, yeah. Yeah, and again, that's a great demonstration that there are always going to be elements of overlap within this. And remember that on some level, just the existence of lament is that confession of trust. Because you're not going to lament to someone that you don't expect to be able to intervene. You're not going to lament to someone that you don't trust to hear your cry. Anyone else have anything to add about this before we move into our final section for tonight? Okay. Well, I'm really glad that I shifted some things we were originally scheduled to do tonight for time, and I'm really glad I did that now. We would have been here for all night if we'd done all that. But don't worry, it's all going to get done. What I want to close with tonight, and this will take a few minutes, so we want to compare lament to the process of secular grief. You were just thinking about it. So Kluber-Ross, and again, I want to offer this disclaimer. I'm not a mental health professional, and I don't claim to be. But as we get into this, you're going to find that this is going to sound very familiar because this is the way that this is ingrained into us culturally, as this is how you deal with grief. See, Elizabeth Kluber-Ross observes grief and comes to the conclusion that this that I'm about to describe to you is the trajectory, the healthy way to encounter grief and to come out on the other side of it. First, when you encounter grief, Kluber-Ross says that you begin in a place of denial and isolation. In other words, no, not me, it cannot be true. This is an immobilizing isolation. And she says that this is a brief and temporary period. You know, you realize real quickly, you start from a place, no, this can't be me, but you realize very quickly, no, it is in fact me. So you can't stay there for long. So you begin in denial or in isolation, but then you move to anger. You're mad. This wasn't supposed to be me. You might even encounter that anger as being victimized, or maybe not feeling important, having to wait, or maybe being the object rather than the subject of what is going on. You are reduced to it. Does that make sense? You feel like your humanity, you don't even feel that humanity anymore. You're just angry. You feel like you're being regarded as something less than. So we start with denial and isolation. We move to anger. And then next, coming out of the anger, we enter into a period of bargaining. Of bargaining. This is our attempt to postpone or to get parole for good behavior. This is at the core an attempt to reduce life to a quid pro quo. Look, I will do this if you will do that. Enticement, right, that we just talked about. So we move from anger into bargaining. So we've got denial and isolation, anger, and bargaining. But when we come out of the bargaining, or maybe more accurately, when our bargaining is not successful, we then enter into a period of depression. This is when it all hits us finally. The weight of what has happened is finally resting on our shoulders. And I think that it's important here in this system that Kluber-Ross lays out for us. When we come to this place of depression, it is characterized by observing the worthlessness of it all. The worthlessness of it all. I want you to remember that, because here in a minute we're going to compare these 5 things that Kluber-Ross lays out to the practice of voicing lament. But when we get to the place of depression, when we observe that from Kluber-Ross's perspective, that depression is the experience of everything you've endured being completely worthless. It didn't matter. I am just suffering for the sake of suffering. There is no value in it. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, and then finally, the trajectory of Kluber-Ross's system of the secular processing of grief leads us to the place of acceptance. It's an affirmation that I'm going to be okay. I can't do anything about it. I'm going to be okay. I just have to accept it and move on. It's a different kind of reorientation. Absolutely it is. Because this is just, I think Kluber-Ross would early on would say, no, it's not a resignation. But I think later on, as she kind of observed it in action, she would say, no, it's just kind of, you just resign yourself. I can't control it. It's like that, what's the prayer of serenity? Help me out. I won't. Yes, accept the things I cannot change. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And the wisdom to know the difference. That's right. That's right. Thank you. I butchered that, but thank you. You guys bailed me out. That is the trajectory here. It's just coming to a place of acceptance, of just saying, this is what happened. I can't do anything about it. I've just got to move on.
This, like with the psalmist and the 5 steps of the psalmist, you can go back and forth with these steps.
Yes. Just as with the laments, there's overlap. It is not chronological. These are just kind of, you may bounce back and forth for years in these. You know, you may stay in 1 through 4 and never make it to 5 in Kluber-Ross's system here. You know, you may never get to that place of acceptance when you're doing this on your own. So, this sounds familiar, right? You've encountered this in some capacity. Even if you've not encountered the first 4, you've certainly encountered this idea, I've just got to get to the place of acceptance. And if we're brutally honest, this has too often been the teaching of the church. We rightfully magnify God's providence and His control, and we reduce ourselves to these robots that just have to accept whatever God has done. That's too often, if it's not the explicit teaching of the church, it is too often the implicit teaching of the church. We allow our people to squander in that way. We minister to our people in their grief in such a way too often. But let's compare this now. Let's compare this system that Kluber-Ross lays out to us to the system of lament. Okay, so Kluber-Ross first says that we arrive at a place of denial and isolation. But how does that compare? What are your first thoughts? How does that compare to lament? I'm sorry?
That's where you feel isolated, which is why you're lamenting.
Well, you're right. You do feel isolated, and we've talked about the fact that God, one of the undergirding questions, the posture of lament is, God, where are you? Where's your presence? And the implication of that is that you are isolated, that you're on your own. But here's the important distinction for us in lament versus the secular process, is that lament is, remember we talked about this last week, lament is rooted in what? Relationship. And so right off the bat, we see that Kluber-Ross's system and the system of biblical lament are not compatible. Because and now, again, I don't want to be uncharitable toward Kluber-Ross, okay? That's not my attempt here anyway. But when we lament, we're immediately acknowledging that though we may feel alone, though we may feel like we've been deserted by God, the fact that we're turning to God with our lament tells us we're in that relationship. There's reason for me to expect things to be different. And so right off the bat, we see that there is a fundamental difference between the expression of lament and the secular model for processing grief. Okay? So Kluber-Ross proposes next that we move into a place of anger. How does this track in our expression of biblical lament? These aren't trick questions. It's right on, right? Lament often expresses anger. Often maybe isn't even the right word. Lament expresses anger, doesn't it? Lament expresses anger. And so we do see some overlap here. We see direct overlap. There's direct correlation. Just as in Kluber-Ross's model, you're angry, you're saying, I'm mad, I'm not being treated the way that I deserve. You're going to find that in laments. God, this is not the deal. This is not what you said you would do. And anger is the expression there. Absolutely. So Kluber-Ross moves from anger to what? To bargaining. Now, you already identified it. Do we see bargaining in lament? Yes. It very much resembles the vow of praise. God, if you will save me, I will praise you. God, if you will reverse this, I will praise you. We see once again the overlap between these two. Well, all right, so moving from the bargaining, Kluber-Ross goes where? To depression. Do we see this played out in the Psalms of Lament? I see some yeses and I see some nos. And I think you're both right. So let me say this. Look at verses, you've got Psalm 13 there in front of you in some capacity. Look at verses 1 and 2. Do you detect some depression there? You're going to find some expression of depression in the Psalms of Lament. You're going to see that sorrow played out. But here's the key difference. We talked about this a moment ago, that for Kluber-Ross, when we enter the season, the experience, the stage of depression, we are encountering that what we are suffering means nothing. But for the psalmist, it's not nothingness, it's hopelessness. Now, I know you're thinking, well, that's not any better. But it is. And we're going to see that in just a moment. So, when we encounter depression from Kluber-Ross's system, it's nothingness. It doesn't matter. There's no reason for this. There's no capacity for this to be formative, growth-inducing. There's no glimmer of light here. It is nothingness. But when we have biblical lament and we have these expressions of depression, it's hopelessness. And it's not that hopelessness is good. It's not that hopelessness is preferable. But we're going to see that hopelessness has the possibility of redemption. And that is a key difference between these two systems. Because where does Kluber-Ross end up? At acceptance. Where does lament end up? In praise. See, lament ends in hope. There's a trajectory there. It's not a promise that God's going to undo what has been done, but it's a promise that in those expressions of depression, in those expressions, God, where are you? I'm feeling isolated. Where are you, God? God, are you going to love me? Am I ever going to be okay? Am I ever going to hope again? The trajectory of being the people of God is always hope. That's why we grieve differently. Right. Paul writes, we do not grieve as those who have no hope. That's why we can stand at the graveside of a loved one. We're not happy about it. Jesus himself wept at the tomb of Lazarus. We're not happy about it, but we can hope. Why? Because there's tomorrow, but why is there tomorrow? Why can we hope? Because Jesus. Because we know that presence, God answered those two questions once and for all, like we talked about last week. We say, God, where are you? And God sends his son to be a man, to walk the earth. And that man walking the earth says, you're going to be with me forever. God answered that question of presence once and for all. And then we also say, God, if you love me, then why? And the implication of that is you must not love me. But God answers that once and for all where? On the cross when Jesus dies for us. And he covers us in the blood of the Lamb. And we are with him forever. That love does not go away. Christ can't be uncrucified. That love has been... We're told we wouldn't even know what love was if Christ had not given himself. And so The trajectory of lament is very different than Kluber-Ross. And you see that is why the distinction between nothingness and hopelessness matters. Nothingness, there's no coming back from that. But hopelessness is reversed through the work of Christ. We may think, I have no hope of God's presence being with me. But God has answered those questions once and for all. And He tangibly answers those questions for us as we endure, as we voice our lament. So, to summarize,
I think there's why there's a lot of people in therapy today. Because we as a church have not taught people how to lament and grieve.
absolutely, that's a contributing factor for sure. And we're going to talk about some more in the next 2 weeks that have contributed to that. That we have not done a good job of communicating the hope that we have. We've not done a good job. And we've also not done a good job of offering the things that are different. Let me be clear, okay? Well, we'll get to that in a moment, okay? I'll be very clear in just a moment, but for now I'm going to continue to be vague. But you're absolutely right. Because we have not utilized these riches that God has given us to navigate those situations of disorientation. And because of it, we got to figure something out. Everyone experiences the disorientation. And you got to figure out some way to get through it. And Kluber-Ross developed a system. It's a good system. It helps people. It does. It helps people. But it doesn't help them as much as they need to be helped. It helps them by offering a substitute for the real help that they need. It's a Band-Aid. That's right. It's a Band-Aid. It's not healing, it's a Band-Aid. Okay, so let me just quickly summarize this for you. We've got denial and isolation for Kluber-Ross, but we know that lament is rooted in relationship. So we've got a fundamental difference right off the bat. Kluber-Ross identifies second anger, and we absolutely identify that in the laments. That's a place of direct overlap. If it were a Venn diagram, that's right where those circles overlap. Third, Kluber-Ross identifies bargaining. We once again find this to be where the circles intersect. We see that bargaining in lament. We absolutely do. It resembles the vow of praise, particularly when that vow of praise is meant to entice God to intervene. Fourth, Kluber-Ross identifies depression. And we do see that in lament. We see the depression, but it's a different kind of depression. For Kluber-Ross, that depression is nothingness. It is void, it is done, it is over and gone. But for biblical lament, it is hopelessness. And I know that that does not sound very attractive, but it makes what comes next possible. Because for Kluber-Ross, we end at acceptance. It's happened, I can't do anything about it, and I got to live with it. But biblical lament ends in hope. I will praise you. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. Hopelessness is answered by hope. Hopelessness is cured by hope. When you reflect personally on your seasons of disorientation, when you put yourself back in that place, I think it would be inconceivable that one of those instances on your paper that you've thought about, that you did not find yourself completely hopeless in that season of disorientation. You did not. I see heads nodding because you get in that moment of disorientation and you think, Lord, this is the one. There's no way out of this one. But then that time of reorientation comes. And it may not come the way we want it to. Our dead loved ones may not have returned to us. The reality may not be exactly what we would have hoped. But we are able to hope again. Why? Because the hope of Christ cannot be extinguished by any season of disorientation. And we're told, look, we are told, Tolkien puts it like this, all sad things will be untrue. Take that in for a moment. I know that's not Scripture, but it's expressed in Scripture. Isaiah says that we will beat our swords into plowshares because there's not going to be any need for them. So in other words, we're going to take our machine guns and we're going to think, I don't have any need for this. How can I use this to cultivate the earth, to bring about flourishing rather than death, to bring about fruit you understand? That is profound. We say that so flippantly, but that is profound. It is perhaps the difference between the old things that are passing away and the new things that are yet to come. We may not can express that any more profoundly than that. That our swords will be beat into plowshares. Instruments of death will become instruments of life and growth and flourishing. So it's not a small thing. I know it is easy to just say, well, hope is better than acceptance, but that really is the whole ball game right there. That's the whole thing. So let's reflect on this for a moment, and then I'll give you your homework for the week. Let's reflect on this briefly. Let me ask you this first. How does hope provide a different outcome for processing grief and or suffering? Now, I've given you a lot of ammo here. That's kind of a maybe poor choice of words based on what I just said, but how is that different? As you think about it yourself, how is hope different than acceptance? How is that outcome different? Hope is better days to come. Acceptance, you're not expecting anything different, are you? You're by definition saying this is the way things are.
Acceptance is inherently backward looking and hope is forward.
Great insight there. So acceptance looks backwards, hope looks forward. Ooh, that's good, Tim. That's important. Acceptance is all about what has happened to me. Hope is all about what is yet to come. Very good. Any other thoughts here between the differences between hope and acceptance? So let me ask you this then. We've seen kind of the secular model for processing grief. And again, I'll be clear in a moment. As I said. Is formative hope possible outside of a relationship with God? Can we come out of disorientation with hope? It's temporary hope. Yes, there you go. It's fool's gold. Can't take it to the bank. It doesn't sustain us forever. And I think it's important for us to link that back to what we talked about earlier. When we are dealing with the formative hope that is expressed in lament, or more importantly, that we encounter in Christ, it supplies us with needs in the future. Right? So you're better equipped for the next season of disorientation because of the hope that you received in the reorientation that came from your last episode of disorientation. Are you tracking? Are you following me there? Yeah. You might think of fool's gold, the value is of no value, but gold appreciates, right? The value tends to go upward. And very poor, quick, insufficient metaphor just to say that's you can find some kind of temporary hope outside of a relationship with God, but the hope that appreciates, the hope that grows, the hope that is not extinguished, we only find that in one place. All right, so how does God's presence change the outcome of lament? When we think about the comparison of Kluber-Ross's system and biblical lament, how does God's presence change that equation? Or does it change that equation? He's the author of hope? Yeah. His presence means that we can reasonably expect hope. In fact, the testimony of Scripture is not that, it's a reasonable expectation. It is who God is. It's what He does.
It's also about the heart. If your heart's in your relationship is with Him,
Yeah.
then definitely His presence in your heart is going to make that.
Bring that hope about. Yeah. So God's presence brings that hope about. Absolutely. Were you?
I think the secular model sends you to yourself.
Yes.
Inward, and the lament model orients you outward to God.
That's a great point. Kluber-Ross, the secular model, inward focused. I'm going to come to a place of acceptance. I have to come to the place of acceptance. But biblical lament says, God, bring me out of this. God, intervene.
The hope at the end of the secular model, like you said, is in yourself. I mean, you can't, there is no, you have the relationship with God that you're able to walk along with Him. I think that's what you just said, but I was just reframing it in my
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, you're able to walk along with him. That presence is with you. Like the fact that you're lamenting to God. Think about a dear, trusted friend. Think about those seasons of disorientation and think to yourself of a friend that you confided in, that you trusted in during that time. Could that friend change your season of disorientation? Unless they were the one that was causing it, no. But when we come to God, not only is He with us in the season of disorientation, but He is able to intervene. So He's with us and He is able to save us. And that's not a small thing. That's in a nutshell how God's presence changes lament versus secular grief. Because you come to acceptance, you're acknowledging, I can't change this. But when you're lamenting and you're hoping in God, you're acknowledging God can change this, and He will. It may not happen today, it may not happen tomorrow, it may not happen until I'm reunited with Him in eternity, but God will change this.
He can change your outlook and your attitude.
Certainly. Yeah, and He'll sustain you in the short, as we still deal with the fruit of a sinful, of the fall, right? As we still live in a fallen world, He sustains us in that. So it's not only, it's that He's with us and He brings about change. Right, so this is, I keep saying I'm going to be clear and then I back off. But here's my question. Can these two systems work together? I see some nodding yes. So?
It's much easier with the Christian perspective because I've had to sit in the other chair.
That's a,
To be able to use God
yeah.
that language.
So Leisha, I don't know if you could hear if everybody could hear, but Leisha's saying it's easier when you're able to mention God. And she says, I've sat in the chair and not been able to bring God into the equation at all. If you don't know Leisha was a psych nurse practitioner for the VA. She retired 2 years ago? 2 years ago. So, that's a much different. So she's very familiar with Kluber-Ross. I'm almost a little embarrassed to have been teaching on this with her in the room, What I'm getting at is this. I think that, no. Sam says no. We're done. You think no? Sam says no. Georgia says no.
Well, I think in Cooper-Ross you get bogged down in that number 4, the depression. I don't think you can ever get to a real acceptance, because you don't have any hope.
That,
So, but in lament you can work through it and eventually get out through acceptance and back into a reorientation process.
I think that's a great point, Georgia. So Georgia says, in Kluber-Ross's model, you're destined to get stuck in point number 4, depression. Because, just the very existence of step 5, acceptance, is the acknowledgement, I can't do anything about this. This is just the way things are. And I think that's a very valid point. But even as we make the point that these two systems are ultimately at odds with one another because of where they end up, and because of where they're directing us, right? We can't be directed towards ourselves and somehow at the same time be directed toward God, right? That's not the way it works. Are you going to teach the end of this, baby? But here's what I think is important for us to acknowledge, is that just as the church has gotten into trouble by denying that we can question God, by denying that we can direct our anger towards God, by denying the tools that lament gives us, there's an equal danger that we deny the gift of counseling, the gift of the tools. It's not unlike just in general medicine, right? If you get sick, if you go to the doctor, are you not acting in faith? You're still acting in faith. You're embracing the gifts that God has given us through modern medicine. And my point that I want to make here is, yes, these systems are not compatible, but if you're in a season of disorientation, if you find yourself in the throes of depression, Going to counseling, consulting mental health professionals is not in any way an indication that you're not acting in faith. And so while these systems are not compatible, that is not an indication that embracing the mental health resources that are available to us is a lapse of faith. The opposite is true. God has given us people like Kluber-Ross that are trying to find a way to help us through the grief. We know that God ultimately is the answer to the grief that we endure, the answer to the suffering that we endure. But consulting mental health professionals, even if you get to a place where, hey, I need to be on an antidepressant or some sort of medication to help me navigate this season, that is not incompatible with lament. That's not what we're saying when we say that Kluber-Ross is incompatible. And that's what I want to be clear about, okay? When I said, I'll be clear in a minute when we get to that, because I knew this question was coming. We want to embrace those tools that have been given to us by God and His goodness to us. But we do so knowing that the answer is not going to be found outside of the kingdom of God. Because that is where all things are put right. That is where all sad things are made untrue. And that is where the hope that can keep us from the nothingness of acceptance can be found. Does that make sense? Does everybody kind of understand the distinction? Kluber-Ross and lament, not compatible. But that doesn't mean that we can't consult mental health professionals. We absolutely can and we should. And I'm proud to say that there are increasingly more resources from a Christian perspective that are very helpful, that are informed by medical advances, but still rooted in the hope of God. And that's where, if you need that help, it's available to you. And even your cooperative program dollars provide that in many states. So the state of Alabama, we have Pathways Professional Counseling. It's a division of the Alabama Baptist Children's Home. We've got licensed professional counselors that are trained and equipped to help you with your grief, but they're doing so informed by the ultimate truth of Christ and Him crucified. Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ will come again. Because that absolutely has to be part of the equation as well. So I don't want to call that a disclaimer. It kind of is a disclaimer, but it's an important distinction because we don't want to neglect that. We don't want to make people, just as we don't want to make people feel guilty for expressing lament, we don't want to make people feel guilty if they're seeking help from a mental health professional. Those Kluber-Ross may not be compatible with lament, but getting help, that's absolutely compatible with lament. Okay? So that's our closing disclaimer tonight, and I think it's an important one. So let's talk about your homework this week. Pam's got some sheets she's going to pass around. This is very much a cousin of last week's homework. Here's what we want to do. You're going to get this sheet. I'll hold it up for you, though I don't think with the yellow text you're going to be able to see it. This is exercise 2. Every week, we're going to, over the course of this 8-week study, have at minimum 8 exercises that help you engage in the expression of lament. This week, our exercise is going to challenge you to look. So last week, you identified at least 3 episodes of disorientation. And then you took one of those episodes and you wrote a lament using cards, 2 questions to guide you. This week, we want to use these 5 elements. We're going to pick a different episode of disorientation than you engaged with last week. So last week, if you engaged with episode 1, this week you're going to go to episode 2. And you're going to put yourself in your shoes when you were living that experience of disorientation. And you're going to write a lament, but you're going to do it using Westerman's 5 elements of lament as your skeleton for doing so. If you had writing prompts in school, this is the same thing. We're using those 5 elements of lament as your writing prompt. I'm going to use that to construct a lament for that season of disorientation. It's my pattern, so to speak, to write this lament. Does that make sense? Everybody feel good about it? And just as this week, I'm not going to ask you to stand in front of the class and read it. I'm not going to ask you to turn it in because I recognize that some of you may have chosen to engage in seasons of disorientation that you don't want to share, and that's okay. Not all of our seasons of disorientation ultimately get expressed publicly, and that's okay too. But you're going to want to engage with these so that you're practicing lament. I also want to say this. Last week, you remember our first time that you got the sheet with the 3 circles? We were thinking about shared experience. We were thinking about experiences of disorientation in the life of our church, right? And so, we're just as you're going to need experiences of disorientation to engage with on exercises like this one I've just given you, we're going to need experiences of disorientation in the life of our church, because we're going to come together as a group at times and work on these. So I want to say this to you. Last week, the table here, which I know we're not all sitting in the same situation, okay? Think about where you sat last week. This table, their church season of disorientation that they cited was the gradual but persistent decline of our church. Okay? This table back here, you guys cited the experience of losing our senior pastor. And then I believe it was this table right here expressed COVID-19 as a season. Okay? So we've got 3 seasons right there of disorientation that we'll keep in the back of our minds for when we have exercises pertaining to shared experiences of disorientation. But with it, I want to risk adding a 4th, and I hope that I won't offend anyone by doing this, but here's what it is that the experience, the encounter that our church had with abuse, okay? And maybe you weren't here for that, that's okay, and I don't want to rehash that or wallow in it, but I think that if we're going to lament, that's one that we need to lament over, okay? So keep that. So we've got actually 4 shared seasons of disorientation as a church that we can learn to lament over together. So when we come to these times of experience, or these exercises that we're going to do together, we've got the gradual and perpetual decline. We've got COVID-19. We've got the loss of our senior pastor, and then we've got grappling with the experience of abuse within our congregation. And certainly these are not the only 4 experiences of disorientation this church has endured, right? But I think these are 4 that will serve us well as we try to practice lament in the life of our church, okay? So if you want to, on your little 3 circles, keep those 3 circle sheets, because you may think of more than the 3 you thought of last week or the 8 you thought of last week. You may think of more this week. But you may even write those 4 across the top there that pertain to our church specifically, so that when we come into those group exercises, you can be reminded of them. I do in my office. Yeah, I can get you a circle page. Yeah, I can get that. Used it up. Anybody else need a circle page? I got some more. Okay. I'll run across and get them. Don't leave, and I'll go grab them. I said this at the very beginning, just one final matter of housekeeping. You see the page in the middle? If you were here last week, you don't have to put anything down but your name. We don't have any new folks this week. So just put your name down so I know who is here, if you don't mind, if you've not already done so. I think you've all done that. But just before you leave, make sure you've signed the sheet on your table so I have a record of your attendance, so it can enter into your permanent record. No. Any questions as we close? Well, thank you. Thank you for being a part of this, and particularly thank you for coming on Father's Day. I know that was inconvenient, but we made it through. Okay? I'm going to go get those 3 circles worksheets for those that need them. Everybody else, thank you for being here. We'll see you next week. And next week we'll shift from the nature of lament to the need for lament. So we'll shift from what is lament to why should we lament. Okay? All right.